We won't harm anyone except for those that deserve it.
Vamos a hacerle
If
daño
you deserve it,
únicamente al que
you
la debe.
better
El que la
hide
debe, sí.
because we will call.
President Trump's war on drug trafficking getting even larger in scale, the president declaring cartels as unlawful combatants, paving the way
against drug cartels. In a memo sent to Congress, the White House saying the U.S. is now in an armed conflict with the narco gangs and labeling their members not just as criminals, but as enemy combatants.
What if the most feared cartel kingpin you've heard about finally met his end in the very walls that were supposed to keep him safe? A shocking new video, now viral across the internet, claims to show Mencho being killed by a group calling themselves Los Chapitos inside a Mexican prison. Last October, a massive U.S.-led raid on San Pedro's quiet docks turned a sleepy harbor into a battlefield, capturing the elusive crown prince of the CJNG and sending shockwaves through both Mexico and the United States. That operation was the beginning of a long-awaited takedown. Now, the footage that has exploded online promises to be the next seismic moment in the global drug war, revealing a brutal death that could reshape the cartel landscape forever. Stay with us as we pull back the curtain on this controversial clip, verify the claims, and explore the far-reaching implications of Mencho's alleged murder by Los Chapitos. The stakes are higher than ever, and the story is still unfolding. The night of October 7, 2025, draped San Pedro in a hush that felt almost conspiratorial, as if the whole city were holding its breath. The sky was a bruised slate, broken only by the relentless glow of searchlights that flared up like a series of angry eyes. High above, helicopters hovered, their rotors slicing through the pre-dawn air, while below, armored SUVs formed a tight wall of steel, sealing every alley and corner. A swarm of federal agents and local police marched in synchronized waves through the residential blocks, their boots echoing against brick and concrete. The streets looked less like a quiet harbor and more like a battlefield carved from steel and steel-cut silence. It was not a random raid. Operation Wipeout was the culmination of a decade-long hunt, the product of relentless surveillance, painstaking intelligence gathering, and an unyielding determination to cut the veins of a criminal empire that had festered beneath the city's surface for years. The target was the Rancho San Pedro Gang, a street organization that had evolved from a local crew in the 1970s into a multi-generational enterprise and, crucially, a front for the Mexican Mafia, a prison-based syndicate that had long exerted control over the region. The gang's structure was intricate. It was divided into 6 distinct subsets, each with its own territory, its own set of responsibilities, yet all answered to a higher authority. 2 of these subsets were composed entirely of women, a fact that underscored the breadth and depth of the organization. Each division operated like a separate business unit, but all shared a common revenue stream, a shared hierarchy, and a shared allegiance to a name that resonated far beyond the city limits. The Mexican Mafia demanded taxes from every criminal activity within its territory. Drug deals, weapons transfers, even illicit businesses run by local entrepreneurs. In return, the cartel offered a sophisticated framework that granted the street gangs operational legitimacy and coordination that would be impossible for an independent operator. Behind prison walls, the Mexican Mafia exercised a brutal brand of control, dictating strict codes of conduct. Any deviation, tax evasion, encroachment, or disrespect could trigger violent retaliation. Cooperation with law enforcement was a death sentence. A single misstep could lead to beatings, arrests, or murder. For the Rancho San Pedro members, the Mafia was both patron and executioner, a dual role that made loyalty almost a matter of survival. The federal complaint, unsealed on the day of the raid, detailed how gang members received orders directly from incarcerated leaders. These commands ranged from tax collection to drug distribution strategies, even the allocation of leadership positions within the gang's own ranks. The investigative work that led to Operation Wipeout was exhaustive. Federal agents and local detectives spent years monitoring the gang's movements. They recorded drug transactions, weapons deals, and violent acts, all while documenting how the money flowed back to incarcerated Mexican mafia members. They identified the shot callers, the individuals who set the direction for the organization, and the enforcers, the muscle that carried out the mafia's will. When the raid struck, it targeted the gang's upper tier. Authorities swarmed 6 buildings on a single block, each a hub of criminal activity that had become the nerve center of the gang's operations. Police and FBI teams conducted simultaneous knocks, leaving no room for error or escape. They moved with the speed of a well-trained unit, a kind that only months of rehearsals and simulations could produce. The result was the arrest of 13 individuals, each a decision-maker, each a conduit for the Mexican mafia's directives. The charges brought against them were severe federal RICO indictments that held the promise of removing the gang from the streets entirely. The raid yielded significant findings. Among them was the realization that the gang's operations were not merely local. They had become an arm of the Mexican mafia, a prison-based organization that used the street gang to exert control and coordinate large-scale criminal activity. The gang had received orders on everything from tax collections from other criminals to the arrangement of drug distribution networks to the acquisition and transfer of firearms. These orders were sent through encrypted channels, relayed by trusted couriers, and executed with chilling efficiency. The revelation was a stark illustration of how an ostensibly small street organization could be a linchpin in a far-reaching criminal conspiracy. The federal agents were not merely arresting individuals. They were severing the lifelines that allowed a syndicate to thrive in the city. They were dismantling a network that had been woven through the docks, the markets, and the neighborhoods of San Pedro. And in doing so, they exposed a shadowy world that had been hidden beneath everyday life. The police officers on the ground described the night as a blitz, a coordinated onslaught that brought together intelligence, strategy, and sheer force to break the cartel's grip. Their next steps involved dismantling the remaining factions, identifying new leaders, and continuing the painstaking work of case building. They vowed that the city would not tolerate such violence again, and that their persistence would continue beyond the arrests. But the raid in San Pedro was only one piece of a larger, more complex puzzle. While the Mexican mafia and its street gang proxies were severely weakened, the cartel Jalisco's Nueva generation, known as CJNG, remained a formidable force. El Mencho's rise to power began in the rural landscapes of Mexico far from the city's docks. Born in Aguila Mataquin on July 17, 1966, his path to becoming a cartel kingpin began with minor drug convictions and the turbulence of being deported from the United States. These early encounters with the law were the opening chapter of a much longer and bloodier story. Upon returning to Mexico, he aligned himself with the Millennial Cartel, gaining experience and connections within the drug trafficking underworld. Around 2009, he founded the CJNG as a splinter group from the Millennial Organization, a move that would transform the cartel into a hyper-violent, highly sophisticated transnational criminal organization. Under El Mencho's leadership, the CJNG came to control critical strategic assets. One of the most pivotal was the port of Manzano, a gateway that became a primary entry point for precursor chemicals shipped from China. These chemicals, essential for the production of methamphetamine and fentanyl, were just the tip of the iceberg. Today, the CJNG operates in all 32 Mexican states and maintains a presence in multiple foreign countries, forming a truly global criminal network. Its product portfolio reads like a catalog of death. Fentanyl, methamphetamine, cocaine, heroin that flowed across the Mexican border in staggering quantities, and synthetic opioids directly linked to the American opioid epidemic, contributing to tens of thousands of overdose deaths annually. Drugs were only one part of El Mencho's empire. The cartel diversified into extortion rackets targeting businesses and agricultural producers, human trafficking operations marked by shocking brutality, and sophisticated financial fraud schemes that moved money through a labyrinth of shell companies and offshore accounts. What made El Mencho particularly dangerous and elusive was his operational style. Unlike flashy cartel leaders who courted media attention, he operated from the shadows, avoiding photographs, public appearances, and even the slightest hint of visibility. His communication channels were encrypted, his couriers trusted, and his movements carefully obscured, making him a ghost in the eyes of law enforcement. The United States government had placed a $15 million bounty on his head, making him one of the most wanted fugitives in the world. Despite this massive reward and the focused efforts of American and Mexican law enforcement agencies, he remained at large, a ghost who orchestrated violence and drug trafficking on a massive scale while successfully evading capture year after year. In a city that had always seemed to rely on the myth of the self-made man, El Mencho's story was a stark reminder that the line between economic opportunity and violent crime is thinner than it appears. Back in San Pedro, the aftermath of the raid settled in like dust. Residents peered out of their windows, wondering what would become of their streets. Some felt a sense of relief knowing that the violent criminal networks had been struck down, while others felt uncertainty about the future. Law enforcement officials were clear that this was a victory but not a definitive end. Their next steps involved dismantling the remaining factions, identifying new leaders, and continuing the painstaking work of case building. The message was one of relentless persistence, a vow that the city would not tolerate such violence again. Operation Wipeout had been a triumph, but it was also the beginning of a new era of vigilance, a new chapter in the ongoing struggle against a criminal empire that once believed it could move unseen through the shadows. The echoes of that night still reverberate in the streets of San Pedro, a reminder that while the battle may have won a key front, the war against organized crime is a long march, and every victory is a step toward a safer horizon. The echoes of that night still reverberate through the streets of San Pedro, a reminder that while the battle may have won a key front, the war against organized crime is a long march. In the days that followed Operation Wipeout, the city moved with cautious optimism, its residents watching as law enforcement crews dismantled a network that had once thrived in their midst. Yet the victory was bittersweet. The silence that settled over the town was not peace, but a pause, an uneasy breath before the next wave of violence could surge through the cracks that remained. By early 2025, a new wave of coordinated raids swept across the Mexican borderlands and into the United States. These operations demonstrated that even the most entrenched criminal enterprises could be toppled if agencies worked in concert, built solid cases, and targeted the core of the organization. The removal of shot callers, those decision-makers who orchestrated day-to-day operations, was a strategic blow, destabilizing the cartel's hierarchy and cutting off the flow of directives that kept its street gangs in motion. Yet the broader story remained unfinished. The CJNG's reach extended far beyond the borders of Los Angeles into every corner of Mexico and across the globe, feeding the opioid crisis in the United States and threatening international markets with counterfeit pills and illicit pharmaceuticals. Despite the apparent strength of these raids, intelligence analysts observed a pattern. Each high-profile arrest did not collapse the cartel outright. It simply forced the CJNG to shift its attention and reorganize. The 2025 law enforcement blitz was a clear illustration of the cartel's resilience. When a key figure in the San Pedro region was apprehended, the CJNG moved its operatives into other territories, tightening the knot in new cities while loosening it in San Pedro. Every time a deputy chief or a logistics head was taken, another operative stepped in, another plan unfolded. This dynamic cat-and-mouse game revealed the cartel's ability to adapt in real time, a trait that had kept it alive since its inception. The legislative response to the threat was swift and decisive. In February, the United States Congress passed a bill that designated the CJNG under the Foreign Narcotics Kingpin Designation Act. This designation amplified sanctions and forced the cartel into a financial cage. The Kingpin Act was not a symbolic gesture. It was a financial war that cut off the cartel's ability to launder money through U.S. banks and money transferring services. The designation triggered an influx of regulatory scrutiny, prompting banks, money transferring operators, and financial institutions across the country to review their compliance with anti-money laundering protocols. The ripple effects were immediate. As the CJNG's digital and financial infrastructure came under fire, the cartel's ability to move funds from one country to another without detection diminished dramatically. In the aftermath of the sanction bill, a series of high-profile indictments rattled the financial underbelly of the CJNG. One such case involved a former banker whose name rose to public notoriety in a federal courtroom. Through offshore accounts in the Caribbean and other tax havens, the banker had processed millions of dollars, providing the cartel with the capital needed to purchase precursor chemicals, expand its drug manufacturing facilities, and purchase secure transport routes across international borders. The indictment was not just a legal victory. It was a public declaration that the CJNG could no longer rely on the veil of secrecy that had once protected its money laundering operations. The case was a stark warning to the cartel's global partners that the flow of illicit funds could no longer move freely through U.S. financial institutions without scrutiny. It exposed a previously invisible network of shell companies, anonymous banking accounts, and clandestine wire transfers that had allowed the cartel to operate with impunity. Around the same time, law enforcement agencies successfully apprehended a lieutenant named Aliano, who had been operating out of a discreet smuggling hub near the port of Manzanillo. Aliano's capture opened a new window into the CJNG's logistical network. Interrogations revealed a complex system of covert transport routes that leveraged both maritime and overland corridors to bring precursor chemicals from the northern ports down to the southern drug production centers. It was a logistical masterpiece. Small, autonomous vessels, disguised as fishing boats, would sail along the Pacific coast, while a hidden network of convoys traversed highways in the shadows of dusk. The discovery of this network confirmed the cartel's ability to adapt. Each time a key node was removed, the CJNG found another to pivot around. Aliano's capture served as a grim reminder that the CJNG's infrastructure was not static, but an ever-shifting tapestry of people, places, and technology. The next strategic shift emerged when the CJNG found a new ally in the Los Chapitos, a faction of the notorious Los Chapitos gang that had long been rivals to the Rancho San Pedro factions. The Los Chapitos, known for their ruthlessness and for operating in the deep south of Mexico, had found common ground with the CJNG in the face of mounting law enforcement pressure. This alliance was strategic. It allowed the CJNG to tap into the Los Chapitos' extensive smuggling routes that extended into the southern United States. The Los Chapitos brought with them a sophisticated knowledge of the U.S. border crossings, and their collaboration meant that the CJNG could continue to infiltrate American communities with counterfeit pills and synthetic opioids while simultaneously keeping their internal operations afloat. While the Los Chapitos were forging these alliances, the United States and Mexico were engaged in a diplomatic standoff. Mexican officials, wary of a unilateral drone strike, warned against actions that could violate their sovereignty. The United States, frustrated by the lack of tangible progress in capturing El Mencho, pushed for a more decisive offensive.
The debate in Washington was intense. On one side, federal agencies argued that each kilogram of fentanyl seized directly translated into fewer pills on American streets, fewer overdose deaths, and a smaller market for the cartel to exploit. On the other side, policymakers and intelligence officials cautioned that a drone strike could backfire, inflaming tensions, jeopardizing ongoing cooperation, and creating a martyr for the cartel's leadership. The conversation became a tug-of-war between military pragmatism and diplomatic prudence, a question of whether to pursue a single high-profile strike or to continue the slow but relentless process of bilateral cooperation. Amid these strategic discussions, a new footage emerged that would capture the public's imagination and bring the story into the global spotlight. A viral clip circulated on social media platforms and reached millions within hours.
The footage, shot inside the grim walls of a maximum security Mexican prison, showed El Mencho, long sought after by law enforcement agencies, as he met his end at the hands of a member of the Los Chapitos. The video begins with a slow, almost cinematic shot of the prison's stone courtyard, its walls weathered by years of institutional use. The camera pans to a cell where a lone figure, known only as the cartel's supreme commander, is seen seated on a concrete floor, his expression unreadable. The tension in the scene is palpable, the silence heavy. A second figure, recognizable by the distinct tattoo patterns that denote his affiliation with Los Chapitos, walks toward El Mencho, his movements deliberate and measured. The video captures a moment of contact, a silent, almost ritualistic exchange that culminates in a sudden, violent end.
As the clip ends, the camera pulls back to reveal the prison's interior, a stark reminder that even in the most secure facilities, power struggles can erupt with lethal consequences. The video went viral within hours, not only for the shocking content, but for what it signified. The killing of El Mencho in prison, orchestrated by a rival faction within the same criminal ecosystem, demonstrated a rare instance of intra-cartel conflict that exposed deep fractures in the CJNG's leadership. The footage showed that the Los Chapitos were not only willing to strike at their enemies, but were also capable of executing violent acts within the confines of a government facility. The image that spread across the internet was not just a viral sensation, it was a turning point that forced both governments and law enforcement agencies to reassess their strategies against the cartel. The implications of this event rippled through the cartel's internal structure.
With El Mencho gone, a vacuum opened at the apex of the CJNG. The leadership had to scramble to fill the void, leading to a succession crisis that split the organization into competing factions. Some members, loyal to El Mencho's legacy, began to consolidate power, forming splinter groups that operated under the old name but with a renewed, decentralized approach. Others, recognizing the shifting power dynamics, started to forge new alliances with smaller local gangs, creating a network that was less reliant on a single charismatic figure. This fragmentation made the cartel harder to monitor and predict, as its operations spread across more nodes with fewer centralized commands. Public perception of the CJNG also shifted. The viral footage served as a potent narrative that could rally public support for continued vigilance against cartel violence. The image of a high-profile leader meeting a violent end in prison became a rallying cry for communities plagued by the cartel's drug trafficking. Media coverage framed the event as a symbolic victory, a tangible example of law enforcement's relentless pursuit of justice. Yet for many, the footage also highlighted the brutal reality of the cartel's culture, where loyalty and power were exercised through violence, even within the supposedly secure walls of a prison. The decision to allow the footage to circulate was not taken lightly. Government officials weighed the risks of publicizing such sensitive material. On the one hand, sharing the footage could deter potential recruits and signal to the cartel that even its most powerful members were not immune to death. On the other hand, critics argued that it could further fuel a cycle of violence by glorifying the cartel's violent acts. The debate centered on whether the benefits of public shaming outweighed the dangers of inadvertently inspiring future acts of brutality. Ultimately, the decision to release the footage was grounded in the belief that transparency and accountability could foster a broader understanding of the threats posed by organized crime.
In the months that followed, law enforcement agencies continued to adapt their tactics. The financial crackdown that had begun with the Kingpin Act designation intensified. New sanctions targeted individuals and companies that had once played the role of unwitting accomplices. Banks were required to implement stricter due diligence measures, scrutinizing any transactions that raised suspicion of being tied to illicit drug production. The FBI and the Mexican National Institute of Investigation and Criminal Defense, INIDEC, worked together to audit the flows of money across borders. They discovered that several U.S. money transferring companies had unknowingly facilitated the movement of cash for the CJNG, prompting a wave of investigations and fines. The indictment of a former banker who had processed millions of dollars through offshore accounts sent shockwaves through the financial industry, forcing institutions to reassess their compliance programs. Meanwhile, the logistics of the CJNG's operations were under constant threat. Aliano's capture had revealed the intricacies of the smuggling routes, but the Los Chapitos had shown they could create new, more secure routes for their own purposes. Analysts observed a pattern. As law enforcement agencies shut down a shipping channel, the cartel's operatives would reroute to a previously dormant route that exploited the lack of scrutiny in less regulated states. The cartel's ability to create small, agile supply chains made it a formidable adversary. However, the increased law enforcement presence forced the CJNG to divert resources from drug production to protection and to expand their operations into new territories, stretching their resources thin. The law enforcement and financial agencies continued to work in tandem, leveraging each new victory to tighten the cartel's constraints. Each financial indictment, each smuggling route interdiction, and each death of a cartel leader, whether through law enforcement action or internal violence, contributed to a larger picture. The CJNG, a once monolithic organization, was now a complex network of competing factions, each with its own priorities and methods. The cartel's internal fragmentation made it less predictable, but the external threat remained as significant as ever. The public, exposed to the viral footage of El Mencho's death, became more aware of the cartel's operations and the ways in which they infiltrated everyday life. The footage served as a catalyst for a national conversation about the cost of crime and the importance of vigilance, both in the public domain and within the financial sector. It also highlighted the importance of international cooperation, as law enforcement agencies had to work across borders to dismantle a transnational threat. The combination of financial sanctions, legal indictments, and public transparency created a multi-layered approach that could deter the CJNG's operations from growing unchecked.